Okay, let's begin. I'm Richard White, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis here at the Hudson Institute. I want to thank everybody for coming and for discussing this critical and timely issue. As you know, the Congress has reconvened and they have a very busy schedule, and among the items they need to address are the two nuclear terrorism treaties. And to help encourage their not being lost in the preoccupation with the budget drills, we have the pleasure to assemble this expert panel here to explain the treaty's importance and discuss their particular details. Thanks to the Connect US Fund, we're able to hold not only this panel, but more than 30 others dealing with a range of important nuclear security issues. And we've had a great partnership with them, and we're very grateful for that effort. After the panel presentation, there'll be a question and answer session. And since we're broadcasting this live, we can take questions over the internet. Just email me at my last name, weitz@hudson.org. And the Twitter feed is simply at Hudson Institute, one word. And if everyone could turn off all your communication devices so that doesn't interfere with the proceedings, we'd be most grateful. I'm now pleased to turn over the session to my colleague, Alex Thoma, who is the Executive Director of Connect US. She will introduce the panelists and moderate the session. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Richard. I'm just going to do it from down here. And I will be quick about this because I know you're here both to hear the speakers, but then also to engage in the discussion and question and answer period. So we're gathered here today, as Richard said. I think the title is apt of this panel, which is Combating Nuclear Terrorism, Overcoming the Senate Impasse. And with last week's results in front of us, or behind us rather, this is a perfect time to be having this discussion. So the questions we asked our three distinguished panelists are, how would these two, so we're talking about two treaties specifically, obviously we're talking about the Senate, we're talking about nuclear terrorism treaties, and there are two treaties that we're specifically talking about, and I'm sure Laura will talk a little bit more about the details of those, but the questions we're using to frame this discussion are, how would these treaties strengthen our ability, America's ability, to combat nuclear terrorism? How does the U.S. ratification of these treaties impact ratification around the world with our allies? And why is U.S. leadership and diplomatic engagement on nuclear security specifically essential to sustaining international support for securing vulnerable nuclear materials and for preventing nuclear smuggling? So without further ado, what I will do is simply try and moderate the panel. All of these speakers are really distinguished, so we have a privilege of hearing them today. I will try and keep them to about 10 minutes or so, so we do have enough time for Q&A. And let me introduce them one by one so that you don't forget who they are right before they speak. So first, to my left is Laura Holgate. She's the Senior Director for WMD, Weapons of Mass Destruction, Terrorism and Threat Reduction at the National Security Staff at the White House. And Laura also plays the role of colloquially what is called a sous Sherpa for the Nuclear Security Summit process, which has been ongoing now for over 2 years. So Laura, take it away.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Richard, and the Hudson team and the Connect US team for pulling this together, and greetings to those not in the room who are taking advantage of the chance to stay out of the cold and still enjoy the conversation today. I confess I didn't read the three questions that you just posed in crafting my remarks, but they are, despite that, remarkably apt, I think. So hopefully I will hit enough of those points to make for a good discussion. Countering nuclear terrorism is an ambition of long-standing bipartisan commitment. Beginning with the landmark Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Act in 1991, Democrats and Republicans in Congress and in the White House have engaged across party lines to create the legal, policy, and programmatic infrastructure that supports today's wide range of efforts to keep the world's most dangerous materials and weapons away from the world's most dangerous people. This infrastructure is often referred to as the global architecture for nuclear security. This architecture includes the institutions, norms, and practices that will reliably secure nuclear materials. The foundations of this architecture are binding international legal instruments that govern national behavior and international cooperation to secure nuclear material and counter nuclear terrorism. Today, this foundation is incomplete. Two cornerstone treaties, the 2005 Amendment to the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, which I will occasionally refer to as the CPPNM, and the International Convention on Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terror, which is called the ISCANT in colloquial terms. These two treaties have yet to reach their full potential. And one big reason for that is that the U.S. has not yet completed the necessary steps to ratify these treaties. The amended CPPNM was launched as a U.S. initiative in the late 1990s to fill a critical gap of the original treaty. The treaty covered physical protection of nuclear materials in transit between countries, but it was silent on protecting materials in storage, processing, or transport when inside a country. And even before 9/11, this gap was recognized, and 4 years after 9/11, the amendment was finally completed, thanks to U.S. leadership and effective international diplomacy, and the U.S. signed it. The amendment requires ratification by 2/3 of the convention states party, or 98 out of 147 countries, however, for entry into force. Today, we're 41 countries short of the amendment entering into force. The second treaty, the ISCANT, was launched as a Russian initiative after 9/11 to create a specific legal basis for international cooperation in the investigation, prosecution, and extradition of those who commit terrorist acts involving radioactive material, or a nuclear or radioactive device, or nuclear facilities. The U.S. participated actively in its negotiation, and we signed it on the first day it was opened for signature in 2005. As with all treaties, these two treaties and two companion treaties related to unlawful nuclear acts at sea were submitted to the Senate for advice and consent, and the Senate granted such in 2008 on a fully bipartisan vote. This support is easy to explain. These treaties are good for the United States national security, they support related policy initiatives, and they draw other countries into a network of cooperation and commitment that reflects the global nature of the nuclear terrorism threat. But we are not receiving these full benefits today. The U.S. has not completed the ratification process and cannot do so until our criminal code is updated to reflect the commitments we made in signing these treaties. Our absence from these treaties has contributed to the CPPN amendment remaining inoperative for the 7 years since it was completed and signed, and to the underperformance of the ISCANT in terms of adherence compared with other UN-deposited terrorism instruments. Other nations are reluctant to proceed when the key architect of these treaties has not completed its own legal blueprint. The administration proposed implementing legislation in 2010 and again in 2011. This legislation is necessary to make sure that we are able to fully investigate and prosecute crimes related to nuclear terrorism, and that we can effectively fulfill our commitments to international cooperation under these treaties. Last summer, this legislation passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support, and as Congress returns to Washington, we eagerly await Senate action on this bill. Once we are able to deposit our own instruments of ratification in New York and in Vienna, we will finally be in a position to advocate effectively for others to join these instruments and to strengthen the global architecture. We know there are countries who are waiting to follow our lead. In Washington, at the 2010 Nuclear Security Summit, universalization of these treaties was highlighted as a goal towards which all 47 countries pledged to work together. And we saw dozens of new ratifications in the months after the 2010 summit. Again in 2012, the second summit in Seoul, 53 countries agreed to press for entry into force of the amended CPPNM by the time of the next summit in 2014. To achieve these goals, the U.S. needs to be able to lead. Our voice is muffled today by our own outlier status. These treaties can also be used as platforms to continue high-level attention to nuclear security after the summit process concludes. While neither treaty creates a formal review process, both treaties have provisions for meetings to discuss implementation. The 2010 Summit Work Plan called on the UN to host an international meeting to review implementation of the ISCANT as provided for in its Article 20. The U.S. is unable to seek such a meeting until we become a state party. But once we do, we will add our voice to those who called during September's high-level meeting at the UN on nuclear terrorism for the Secretary General to convene such a review. This could become a regular meeting to highlight progress made and share best practices in implementation. Similarly, the IAEA's Nuclear Security Conference next summer, which the Director General intends to convene every 3 years, could be put in service of reviewing progress on the amended CPP&M. These regular engagements could be used to emphasize outcomes and deliverables, similar to the summit's house gifts, and to attract ministerial-level participation. It could even draw from the experience of the Convention on Nuclear Safety, in which countries submit regular reports for peer review by other states' parties. Such steps could strengthen considerably not only the legal basis, but also the norms and practices supporting nuclear security commitments. These examples demonstrate the living nature of treaties such as these. Once entered into force, they do not merely sit as static components of the global nuclear security architecture. Rather, they provide a platform on which to build expectations and behavior that can over time transition from the so-called soft law into the hard law of future treaties and arrangements that expand the coverage of these legal structures. President Obama called in Prague for a nuclear future in which countries play by the rules and are held to account. Our own delay in ratifying these treaties is standing in the way of strengthened rules and limiting tools for accountability. The sooner we can play our part, the sooner these keystones can be cemented into place, and the rest of the architecture will be stronger for it. A resilient, durable nuclear security architecture will keep America safe and create the global commitments that are required to counter the greatest threat that we face. These are plans everyone should be able to get behind. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. That was wonderful. I think Chris is next, right? Great. So Chris Ford is here at the Hudson Institute. He's a senior fellow, but he's also a former U.S. Special Representative for Nuclear Nonproliferation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Let me start by thanking Connect US and for joining with us in sponsoring this event. One of the nice things about the nonproliferation beat is how relatively bipartisan it is. We certainly quibble with each other over the details of the policy agenda from time to time. There have been some major points of difference over the years. But by the standards of many issues that I deal with, nuclear weapons are one of those perhaps, nuclear energy may be another, it is refreshing to remember how consistent U.S. policy has been for quite a long time. This is one of those arenas in which, for the most part, it is indeed possible to say that there is a truly American agenda and a broad policy consensus in this country. And the prevention of nuclear terrorism is obviously something on which we all agree. I will certainly not disagree, I think, with any of my fellow participants here today on the importance of getting the implementing legislation for these two treaties through. You don't need me to summarize them, but ISCANT and the CPP&M amendment are, in my view, both very important. It's certainly to be regretted that we haven't gotten through the implementation legislation yet, but these are widely supported agreements. They support principles that I think we can all endorse on this. And let me underline the point that Laura made, and I think the domestic fate of the CPP and M amendment does have a very direct bearing on the international fate of that amendment. As we heard from Laura, it does require ratification by 2/3 of the parties to that convention, and quite a few states still have yet to do this. This is a question of U.S. leadership, and I would agree with Laura that it is difficult to ask others to undertake ratification when we are making a big show of finding implementing legislation too hard on the home front. Now, I'll leave it to others to discuss the details of the hang-up and how we might be able to get through it, but at least I'll say briefly my own limited understanding. You guys are probably more current than I am, but my understanding of where things and why things stand at the moment in the Congress. As I understand it, there's disagreement over specific provisions that apply or do not apply, as the case may be, the death penalty to nuclear terrorism, and that provide special federal wiretapping rules for nuclear incident investigations. These provisions were requested by the Obama administration, but they were rejected by the House Judiciary Committee as government overreaching that was unnecessary to the urgent task of implementing the treaties, as it was described at the time. The House passed the act without those provisions, but an amendment sponsored by Senator Grassley in the Senate Judiciary Committee seeks to put these back in. There's also a technical fix of some sort, which I don't fully understand, but that I'm sure can be worked out. According to Patrick Leahy, Senator Leahy, on the Judiciary Committee, the main holdup right now is an anonymous Republican hold on the bill. But of course, even if this were overcome, it remains true that there are in fact different versions running around, and the House and the Senate would have to reconcile those either by conference or by the sort of traditional ping pong games that they play back and forth between the chambers. For their part, Senator Grassley's staffers have been quoted in the media as saying that that his amendment is in fact acceptable to Senate Republicans, but that the bill is being held up by the Democrats. I'm told from contacts on the Hill that there is little optimism that the legislative schedule or the process will be able to move quickly enough to bring this to fruition this year. Now, on the positive side, it sounds to me, and like agreement is indeed likely at some point, though it may take the next Congress to do that. But let me repeat that I do hope this impasse is overcome soon, because it is necessary to pass this implementing legislation. U.S. leadership is important in building momentum for ratification of the CPP&M amendment internationally, and both of these things are important additions to our criminal code and laws here at home. As President Bush observed in forwarding the CPP&M amendment to the Senate in 2007, and as Obama administration officials have repeated, it is indeed important in the campaign against international nuclear terrorism and nuclear proliferation. And let me say that the issue of U.S. leadership on these issues is important in broader, more principled terms as well. The U.S. has shown exemplary leadership in a number of non-proliferation issues for quite a few years, and it would be a shame, I think, to tarnish our image in this particular respect. On specific matters related to the prevention of nuclear terrorism and nuclear weapons more broadly, for instance, the U.S. diplomats have for many years been at the forefront of the international community on a number of critical issues, including developing the Proliferation Security Initiative and the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, both of which contribute in profound ways to doing the same tasks that this implementing legislation would also further. We've been been global leader in the press against state proliferation of nuclear weaponry as well, such as with Iran, beginning with the Natanz revelations of August 2002 and continuing to this present day, with Iraq beginning well before that under the administrations of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and in dismantling the Libyan WMD program as well in 2003, 2004. This is not an arena in which the United States can or should lead from behind, and we have an important role to play both in modeling non-proliferation seriousness for others and in helping to pressure those others into adopting international best practices such as those that are represented by ISCANT and the CPP&M amendment. So I add my voice to others here saying that I really hope that this is resolved. But as we look beyond simply this legislative question, let me put my gadfly hat on a little bit and say a word about U.S. leadership on an additional but related matter. Many of you may have missed it, and one certainly didn't hear administration officials talking much about it before the election, because the message, to the extent that it concerned nuclear security at all, and I regret to say that these issues were not at the forefront of the American people's consciousness for the last several months, but it was to suggest that the nuclear security summits in 2010 and 2012 were in the process, in effect, of solving the problem of loose nuclear material, as President Obama indeed, I think, implausibly promised in 2009 to achieve within 4 years. But in September 2012, if you did catch it, you will have noticed that the Government Accountability Office issued a report describing persisting and significant gaps in security measures surrounding radiological sources stored at medical facilities around the United States. Now, the issue of radiological security, as you will probably be aware, was one that was outright ignored at the first Nuclear Security Summit, and which was mentioned only in passing at the second one in Seoul. But it's a serious issue. Radiological sources, of course, are the active ingredients in what one might call a dirty bomb, an RDD, a radiological dispersal device, which is easier to make than a nuclear weapon and could still cause enormous disruption in any major urban area. These kinds of things can be constructed by terrorists rather easily. For doing so only requires conventional explosives and then a radiological source of radioactive material of the sort that many hospitals and research centers keep on hand. Thankfully, no one's ever set off such a thing. But they're not unheard of. Chechen terrorists left a container of cesium in a Moscow park in 1995, for instance, apparently to make a point, and a dirty bomb was reportedly found and defused in Chechnya in 1998. For its part, Al-Qaeda is said to have been interested in such things for quite some time, and indeed would-be terrorist Jose Padilla reportedly conspired with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed himself on a dirty bomb plot before his capture, actually both of their captures at different points, in 2002. There are, by various estimates, something between 100,000 and a million radioactive sources worldwide, many of which might in fact be useful in an RDD. According to the U.S. National Nuclear Security Administration, many radiological sources at sites around the world have been abandoned or orphaned, others are poorly guarded, creating a significant risk of theft or sabotage. Unfortunately, the GAO report in September suggests that we even do a surprisingly poor job of securing our own radiological sources. So here's an area that is very relevant to the fight against nuclear terrorism as well, on which we need to do a better job, and I urge that we do so as well. Leadership is needed in this respect, in addition. So I look forward to our discussions, and once again, I certainly hope that we can get through the Senate impasse and get the implementation legislation for the ISCANT and the CPPNM amendment as soon as possible.
Thanks, Chris. I agree. And I'm actually really glad you brought up radiological, and I'm sure Laura, perhaps in the discussion, can touch on how the nuclear security summits going forward are starting to incorporate that a little bit more. Kingston Reef is the Director of Nuclear Nonproliferation at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation, and I think will bring us up to speed on what's happening on the Hill, and then maybe reflect a little bit on what Chris and Laura have said.
Well, thanks very much, Alex, and thanks to the Hudson Institute for inviting me to speak here this afternoon on such a vitally important topic. Now, we've heard Laura and Chris make the substantive case for swift congressional approval of the implementing legislation for the 2005 CPPNM Amendment and ISCANT. Indeed, it is a testament to the strong bipartisan support enjoyed by these treaties that both Laura, currently an official in the Obama administration, and Chris, formerly an official in the George W. Bush administration, are delivering the same message here today. My role this afternoon is to provide a brief synopsis of the status of the treaties and the implementing legislation in Congress, how we arrived at the current impasse, and what might be done to overcome it, and what little time remains in the 112th Congress. And both Laura and Chris have already scratched the surface on some of these issues. And I'm just going to attempt to put a little more meat on the bones. Now, as we've already heard, the George W. Bush administration submitted the treaties to the Senate in September 2007 for its advice and consent, and the Senate overwhelmingly approved them in September 2008. However, prior to U.S. ratification, the agreements require the United States to pass implementing legislation to criminalize specific offenses. Both treaties establish specific criminal offenses related to proliferation and terrorism that state parties must include in their criminal codes. For example, ISCANT establishes certain criminal offenses relating to the possession and use of radioactive material and radiological dispersal devices and damage to nuclear facilities, while the 2005 CPPNM amendment criminalizes nuclear smuggling and the sabotage of nuclear facilities. The Bush administration sent draft legislation to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees in 2008 after the treaties were approved by the Senate, but Congress did not act before the 2008 election. The Obama administration first sent draft legislation to Congress in late March 2010. At the first Nuclear Security Summit held in Washington in April 2010, the United States pledged to accelerate efforts to complete U.S. ratification procedures on the nuclear terrorism treaties. However, the legislation was not introduced in the 111th Congress. As you may recall, the Senate was busy with another nuclear-related treaty, namely the New START Treaty. In addition, House Democrats, who were in the majority at the time, expressed some concerns about the administration's proposed legislation, which I'll expand upon in a moment. Now, the Obama administration again submitted the legislation in the 112th Congress on April 13, 2011, the first anniversary of the Nuclear Security Summit. The goal was to achieve ratification before the 2012 Nuclear Security Summit to be held in Seoul in March 2012. Despite stepped-up outreach from the Department of Justice and State Departments, Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee, now in the minority in the wake of the 2010 elections, continued to object to certain provisions of the implementing legislation. In particular, they objected to provisions that would expand the scope of federal crimes punishable by the death penalty and add to the list of federal wiretap predicates. The House Judiciary Committee, specifically the Crime and Terrorism Subcommittee, held a hearing on the administration's proposed legislation on October 5, 2011. The hearing was a hopeful sign in that it demonstrated the committee's interest in the subject and the possibility that it might soon introduce and report out an actual bill. But the hearing revealed that there continued to be strong differences between the administration and Democrats on the subcommittee, led by Ranking Member Representative Bobby Scott. It also revealed that the Republican majority, led by Representative Jim Sensenbrenner, wanted a bipartisan bill and were thus prepared to back their Democratic colleagues in their negotiations with the administration. At the hearing, the Department of Justice explained that while there is substantial overlap between existing U.S. anti-terrorism laws, including those implementing anti-terrorism treaties, and the crimes covered by their version of the draft implementing legislation, there are gaps between what existing law criminalizes and what the the 2005 CPPNM and ISCANT require. For example, regarding the sabotage of a nuclear facility, U.S. law already prohibits a person from damaging or destroying a nuclear facility, but the current statute does not cover threats of sabotage by the nuclear treaties. The implementing legislation would criminalize this latter offense. In addition, the Justice Department made proposals that were not strictly required to implement the treaties, but which they thought were necessary for their purposes. For instance, as already mentioned, the legislation would expand the scope of federal crimes punishable by the death penalty. The Justice Department argued that this provision was appropriate given that the death penalty is available for other comparable federal terrorism offenses. Furthermore, the legislation would make the offenses prohibited by the treaties as a predicate offense for wiretapping. DOJ argued that wiretap should be available to allow law enforcement agents to investigate the WMD and terrorism-related offenses established pursuant to the implementing legislation, just as wiretaps are available to investigate other terrorism offenses, such as money laundering. However, the Democrats on the subcommittee continued to argue that the legislation was far too sweeping, that the gaps between the treaty obligations and current law were not as large as DOJ claimed, and that the additional provisions not required to implement the treaties were superfluous. And so in limbo, the implementing legislation and treaties remained while the administration and House Judiciary Committee attempted to iron out their differences. Meanwhile, the 2012 Nuclear Security Summit, held in Seoul in March, came and went without U.S. ratification of the two treaties. The communique from the 2012 summit now encouraged states that had yet to do so to bring the 2005 amendment to the CPPNM into force by 2014. It was not till later in the spring, nearly 2 years after the administration first submitted the legislation, that the administration and House Judiciary Committee agreed to compromise legislation. On June 5th, the House Judiciary Committee introduced H.R. 5889, the Nuclear Terrorism Convention's Implementation and Safety of Maritime Navigation Act of 2012. The committee reported it favorably to the full House on June 6th, and the full House approved it by voice vote on June 28th. Crucially, as Chris already mentioned, the bill does not include the provisions expanding the scope of conduct subject to the death penalty and adding a new wiretap predicate. Supporters of the bill were hopeful that the Senate would quickly take up and pass the House version of the legislation, but those hopes proved overly optimistic. In mid-September, Senate Judiciary Chairman Patrick Leahy recommended quickly moving the House bill straight to the Senate floor for a vote, and stated in a September 20th letter to the editor in the Washington Times that Republicans were holding up the bill. However, Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley, the ranking member on the Senate Judiciary Committee, wanted the bill either to be referred to the committee where members could offer amendments or allow for amendments on the Senate floor to reconcile the differences between the House bill and the original administration proposal. Senator Grassley opposes the exclusion of the provisions that would impose the death penalty for nuclear terrorism and related offenses, wiretap authorization for investigating those offenses, and authorization of the prosecution of financiers and others who support terrorists who commit those offenses. Before the Senate broke for the election recess, Senator Grassley sought to discharge the House-passed legislation from the Judiciary Committee with an amendment that restores the controversial provisions. The request was apparently supported by other Republicans on the committee. And so in limbo, the legislation remains. Senator Grassley's proposed amendments would likely doom the legislation in the House. And if the legislation is not passed in this session of Congress, which will run out in a matter of weeks, then we'll be back to the drawing board as the administration will have to reintroduce the legislation. It is vital that the Senate pass the implementing legislation, which has already been approved, as we've noted, by the GOP-led House in this session of Congress. Swift congressional approval is important not only to ensure that U.S. laws are sufficient, but also to help prod other countries into action. At the Nuclear Security Summit held in Seoul in March 2012, as Laura has already mentioned, more than 50 countries pledged to seek the entry into force of the CPPNM amendment by the next Nuclear Security Summit in 2014. The longer the United States is unable to ratify the amendment, the more difficult it will be to ensure entry into force by 2014. Now, right now, there does not appear to be an immediate way forward, as neither Senator Grassley nor the House Judiciary Committee has indicated that it is willing to give in. But there is still time. Previous lame duck sessions have witnessed a flurry of legislative activity. And I think what would really be helpful and useful at this moment is leadership from one or two senators, ideally both a Democratic senator and a Republican senator, to make both publicly and privately to their colleagues the case for these two vitally important treaties in an effort to help break the dam. As we all know, the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program originally began and was conceived of by Senators Nunn and Lugar, so that type of leadership on nuclear security is something that I think needs to be mimicked in the case of these two treaties. And with that, I want to thank the Hudson Institute and hope that we can have a discussion about many of the issues that were just raised.
Thank you very much. We can take questions from the audience. If you just raise your hand, someone will come over and bring a mic to you, and if you can, state your name and affiliation. And again, we can also take questions over the internet or by Twitter. My internet email address is Weitz, W-E-I-T-Z, last name at hudson.org. And Twitter, it's the call sign is just Hudson Institute. Thank you.
Greg?
Greg Thielman, Arms Control Association. I have the impression that the failure of the U.S. to move forward this fall is actually adding insult and injury to our status with other countries in the world from whom we want cooperation. If in fact the death penalty is a significant reason for it being blocked, since the United States is an outlier in terms of whether or not the death penalty should ever be applied in the world. And it seems like then that it's not only we're going to be delaying it, but we're going to be delaying it for a reason that the rest of the world does not agree with us on. And I guess my final little asterisk to this question is noting that Senator Grassley represents a state that eliminated the death penalty in 1965.
I'll just remark, and I note I have several friends from embassies in the room, so they might speak up themselves. I'm not sure that the intricate political reasoning behind our lack of progress has been that visible to most of our international partners, which, as you say, may be a good thing. I think they take, the ones that I interact with take at face value that the administration is prioritizing this and trying to work it hard, that the challenges sit on Capitol Hill, and that ability of the administration, Capitol Hill, to work together has not been, at its top level over the last few years. So I think we get a good faith pass on one hand, but I think we still have a lot of countries that are saying, well, once you get yours done, then come talk to us.
If I could add, I think it is important that other countries are looking to where we go on this, as I indicated in my remarks. And frankly, my guess, though I haven't studied this, is that many of the countries that we're hoping to persuade to go through the ratification process, especially in the CPPNM amendment, where they're waiting for us, perhaps to some extent, are countries who, probably need this kind of legislation to cover gaps rather more than we do, in fact. I think there are obviously some gaps in our legislation, although I have no doubt that if a nuclear terrorist incident occurred right now, that we would find dozens of statutes to throw at the perpetrators should we be able to catch them. So frankly, some of the other folks out there whom we're trying to persuade probably need this more than we do, and it would contribute to that much more importantly, I think, to the progress of the international community's fight against these challenges. That said, I don't want to oversell I don't want to overread the death penalty point, because of course that's not the only issue. There are wiretapping issues on which we are one of the more scrupulous countries in terms of our judicial process in the world. Many countries don't bat an eyelash at that sort of thing. So we are perhaps an outlier in that regard in a way that you might perhaps more approve of. And there's also the issue, I believe there's the definition of a place or a public transportation system. It's a very minor technical fix, but sometimes those things matter as well. So it's not the only issue out there either.
The only thing that I would add is it's not always the case that what's good for the House should be good for the Senate. But I think in this case, where you have bipartisan agreement in the House of Representatives on the compromise legislation, that there's no reason why the Senate shouldn't be able to take this up quickly and to pass it. So, as Chris also mentioned, it's not looking great at this point, but there is still time in the lame duck, and I think it would be very useful, as I mentioned, if senators on both sides of the aisle who are very supportive of robust U.S. leadership on nuclear security, continue to have a conversation with Senator Grassley about the importance of this legislation to see what might be able to be worked out. And even if nothing can be worked out in the lame duck, at least that can be an important down payment on ensuring swift passage in the next Congress.
Other questions from the floor? Yeah. Could you just say your name and organization, please?
Sure. Hi, Kenny Fletcher with Nuclear Weapons and Materials Monitor. My question's for Laura Holgate. I was hoping we could talk maybe a bit in a broader stroke the administration's agenda for the second term with regards to nuclear security, nonproliferation, ratification of the CTBT, start of negotiations on fissile materials cutoff treaty, future reductions, and sort of all that. Where the priorities lay, what sort of timeline might we see with that?
That's a different speaker and a different panel. I don't work any of those issues that you just mentioned, so
Okay. Well,
I'll leave those to my colleagues.
Far be it for me to speculate. Though I may at some point, but not today.
Just to let people know, we have a couple more series planned when that question might be more pertinent. We have somebody from State Department, for example, coming probably 29th in the morning. I'm still finalizing that panel. And then, as you know, Bonnie Jenkins, Ambassador Jenkins' panel was canceled because of the weather. So we'll have that, and we might have a couple others too.
I could
She
say a
changed
couple
her
words
mind.
about the nuclear security agenda, which you did not mention in your laundry list of acronyms and treaties. The Netherlands will be hosting the Nuclear Security Summit in 2014, and so we're obviously eager to work closely with them to achieve the same kind of tangible outcomes that we've seen in other agendas or other summits. There is an open question about whether 2014 will be the final summit. And I think there's some countries who would argue that it should. There's other countries who find value in this ongoing biannual check-in at the highest level. We're a little bit from Missouri on this. If you'll take the show me mantra from that part of the world, in terms of show me that we have adequately increased and improved this architecture that I was talking about, whether it's treaties, whether it's the institutional capabilities at the UN and the IAEA and Interpol, whether it's national regulatory behavior and organizations and structures and so on. And we'll know that strengthened architecture when we see it. And that's the point at which a summit process can logically conclude. Whether that's 2014 or a different date, I think we're not in a position to make a U.S. government argument on that. But we are definitely going to be looking at the next 18 months as a way to uplift the UN and the IAEA in terms of their capabilities to accomplish their nuclear security mission. You heard me mention the Director General's intention to create an every 3-year meeting at the IAEA focusing on nuclear security. We will be, again, trying to get these treaties, through our process and then through the range of other countries' processes, and naturally continuing all of the various bilateral and multilateral threat reduction projects and policy structures that we have been pursuing, whether it's a global partnership, a global initiative, PSI, similar kinds of activities, and certainly finding an ongoing legal basis to work bilaterally and in third countries with Russia on the threat reduction agenda.
Laura, while you have the floor, could you address Chris's good point about radiological security as well, and then I'll have Kingston answer the question.
I think there's no question that this administration in the first summit prioritized fissile material over radiological material for the mere fact that nothing else can create a smoking ruin of a city besides a nuclear bomb. Radiological terrorism is certainly very possible, very threatening, very concerning, but it's not even on the same playing field as nuclear terrorism. So we wanted to be sure that in the first summit that we focused on the fissile materials. The second summit, those countries who were advocating for more on nuclear material, on radiological materials in the first summit had a chance to add some language, and you saw that reflected in the 2012 summit. I expect there will be additional language put forward in 2014. The U.S. will support that. I think our national activities through the through the Global Threat Reduction Initiative and our own domestic efforts through NRC are strong and working to deal with our own security issues as well as helping other countries take care of theirs. Is there more that could be done there? Almost certainly. So that's, again, defined by budgets and priorities. And I do think that it's been appropriate that we put our priority first on highly enriched uranium, plutonium, and the potential for the nuclear devastation that those two materials can create.
Yeah, just to provide my perspective on what the administration's second term might look like on nuclear security and nuclear threat reduction. I mean, as you mentioned, when the administration came to office, it laid out a rather ambitious set of proposals on this agenda, and I would argue that significant progress has been made. Some of the high-profile achievements include negotiation and ratification of the New START Treaty, a new nuclear posture review, 2 successful, I would argue, nuclear security summits, a final document at the 2010 NPT review conference. However, there are a number of issues on this agenda that remain outstanding, and I think with the election behind it, the administration may find a window a brief window in 2013 and perhaps 2014 where it can push some of these the other items on the agenda. One in particular on the nuclear force reduction side of the aisle is an interagency review of high-level U.S. nuclear policy guidance, much of the work of which was done in 2012, but a final decision was pushed off because of the looming election. And this guidance is largely determines the targeting requirements for U.S. nuclear forces and ultimately what the ensuing structure and number of nuclear forces the United States needs for its security. And it may ultimately, too, serve as a kind of negotiating position for what the administration hopes to be another set of negotiations with the Russians on bilateral force reduction. So I think this high-level employment guidance is something that the administration is certainly likely to revisit as it begins its second term. Iran, obviously, a very big issue as well, and it seems clear that the administration would like to resolve the current impasse with Iran diplomatically, and so we may see them engaging in additional conversations with the Iranians, both bilaterally and in the context of the P5+1. So you also mentioned the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. That it, again was an issue that the administration outlined and prioritized in when it first came to office, and is an issue that it may decide, and hopefully from our perspective decide to push again, but it remains to be seen if the votes will ultimately be there in the Senate. And so it's going to require a very concerted and perhaps patient effort to build support for the treaty, both inside the Senate and outside of it.
I can't resist. I'm sorry.
There you go.
I mean, without getting into the merits of some of these issues, I think it may be on some of these very same points where some of the bipartisan wheels, as it were, start to fall off of the cart on the nuclear agenda more broadly. I'm not so concerned about CTBT in the sense that a treaty that is unlikely ever to be ratified, and if ratified would never probably come into force anyway, isn't something which would probably spend a great deal of political capital trying to pursue. The nuclear posture issue is, however, I think much more important. And given all the fun that everyone had trying to get New START ratified, my guess is that whatever comes down the block is very likely to be, during the second term, a question more of presidential unilateralism, sort of a PNI, it's kind of presidential nuclear initiative redux, but done with a different geopolitical context when things are perhaps looking more grim rather than more favorable, and it could be indeed, I think, very controversial. The word on the street is that there is talk of reductions to the magic number of perhaps 1,000 or so operationally deployed warheads, which many suspect would represent essentially a process driven by the allure of that nice round number rather than by any necessarily coherent or ethical difficult process of deciding what our strategic needs are. These are issues on which the chairs will probably start to get thrown again in Washington. But at least until that point, I think we can all join hands and still keep saying kumbaya when it comes to getting the implementing legislation through on ISCANT and the CPP and its amendment.
Thanks, Chris. I would be remiss if I did not also mention the Connect US Fund organized a joint letter from all our community members, over 181 leaders representing millions of Americans, on kind of on your question, what are some of the priorities? We looked at nukes. We also looked at human rights and climate, not what y'all probably are focused on, but if you want to take a look at that, it's on our website. I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
Bob Bovee from the Institute for Defense Analyses. Bob Bovee from the Institute for Defense Analyses. One of the first questions in our little handout was, how could these two treaties strengthen America's ability to combat nuclear terrorism? And they've been floating around so long, I think I've forgotten. Could you all revisit why it is we're doing these, and why it is that it's going to help us combat nuclear terrorism?
I'll start, and I know these gentlemen will fill in blanks that I leave because I don't have the document directly in front of me. But the primary gap that this legislation fills is our ability to effectively institute and investigate and prosecute crimes related to nuclear terrorism and radiological terrorism. If they're not defined properly as actual crimes in our criminal code, it's hard, we can't investigate them effectively. We can't bring cases on that basis. And so, as Chris said, if there were actually an act of nuclear terrorism, we would probably find plenty of parts of our criminal code to throw at it. But these treaties call for each country to explicitly criminalize particular behavior, and there's some of that behavior that we had not yet criminalized. And so fundamentally, it's to enable us to prosecute effectively. But there's also requirements in these treaties that call on us to share information with other countries if we happen to know in advance about attacks on facilities in their country or on material in their country. And so we also need to be sure that that legal basis is put into place. So it's motherhood and apple pie at one level. It's technical, judiciary committee, statute writing at another level. But fundamentally, the point is, let's get the global community on the record in the form of treaty ratification as opposing both in word and in deed the nuclear terrorism that they are designed to combat.
Yep. I don't have much to add except that just to remind everyone that these things didn't sort of get dropped by a sort of an amorphous, exogenous international community onto our laps. These are things that we negotiate. And there's a reason why they have the provisions that they do. And I think it makes common sense for us to live up to what we ask of others and declared in 2005, and again with advice and consent in 2008. And everyone agrees in principle is very important. Though they may disagree on how the legislative answers should be arranged. So things. The CPPNM amendment is the easiest to explain in terms of its substantive additional changes. As Laura mentioned, provisions that relate to nuclear material security in transit are very important and very good. But that's not the only place that nuclear materials show up. They also sit around in between being in transit, and having a global regime that clearly covers those issues when they are in fact in their ordinary homes during in between their vacations. It's very important to keep them secure then as well. And I think building not only at home but using our example and our political leverage to help make sure that other people close that gap, I think is quite important.
Great, thanks. Other questions? Sure, right up here.
Hi, Dmitry, Heritage Foundation. I just wanted to ask, how would criminalizing nuclear terrorism deter nuclear terrorism? I mean, criminalizing murder doesn't really deter murder. I mean, I would say that physical protection is critical, but how would criminalizing help combat nuclear terrorism?
Well, there's a whole strain of scholarship relating to the deterrability of terrorists. And I don't think this is the right place to get into that. I think the point is, if there is an act of nuclear terror, we as a nation want to be able to prosecute it. That's not to say that that's more important than physical protection. Obviously, we spend enormous amounts of money on physical protection, and so far, almost no money on prosecuting nuclear terrorists because we haven't actually had them yet. So, I think we're focusing in this conversation by its definition on gaps, which leaves aside all of the other really important work that's being done. And I think one of the things to come back to a piece of the answer of the previous question of how does this help the U.S. security, most of what we would do to comply with these treaties we're already doing. It's what other countries do to comply to these treaties once they become into effect. So it's not just our physical protection, which is clearly meeting international guidelines, but our confidence in other countries doing the same thing. And that confidence comes about through a whole range of activities, some of which bilateral collaboration, some of which international commitments of this nature. So part of the benefit of these treaties to the U.S. government is having more confidence that other countries are living up to their treaty commitments to secure their material and to be able to prosecute any terrorist behavior and their nuclear terrorism behavior on their soil.
It's an interesting sort of graduate seminar question about the deterrability of terrorism versus the deterrability of murder. Clearly, we have laws against murder, and they don't prevent murder in all cases. It's not a magic wand, but I haven't heard anyone suggest that we should decriminalize murder just because it hasn't been a fail-safe in preventing the problem from happening. My suspicion is that there's a good reason why we keep it criminalized, and I have no problem with criminalizing nuclear terrorism as well as we possibly can. And also, we're not just talking about the direct participants and perpetrators. Nuclear terrorists presumably wouldn't be able to do what they do entirely on their lonesome. And to the degree that they have collaborators, co-conspirators, and people who are involved in that, they may be subject to a different deterrent scheme that is not necessarily entirely warped by some sort of hypothetical ideological enthusiasm that makes them happy to die or to be punished for their cause. I think there is good that this kind of thing can do, and I would like to see us do a better job at doing it.
Great. Thank you, Chris and Laura. We have other questions from the audience. Yes, Ryan.
Ryan Castell with the Connect US Fund and Fiscal Materials Working Group. Question for the panel. If the legislative clock runs out, is there any hope for entry into force by the 2014 Nuclear Security Summit? And also, Laura, I'm wondering if you can comment on sort of the U.S. hopes and expectations both for the Sherpa meeting in Istanbul, which I believe is later this month, and also the 2014 summit. Thanks.
What? The short answer, I don't know. I assume that all the work that's gone into this to get the legislative process to where it is would not have to be entirely reinvented. Although one imagines that, given the way that these procedures work, it wouldn't happen super quickly or necessarily right out of the box. I don't know. I couldn't begin to handicap odds for completion by 2014. I just don't. All right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to that other than we'd rather not have to see if there's enough time if we push this into the next Congress. So, like I said, things have gotten done in lame ducks before. There's still time. Obviously, Congress has a very full legislative plate, but a lot of what's on their agenda in terms of the fiscal cliff and other large spending issues are not things that are going to be solved immediately upon the return, which occurred today. So there is time to try and move the needle forward on this.
Yeah, I think it's just, every day longer that it takes is a day of less U.S. diplomacy and pressure in the world, the leadership that everyone's been talking about. So, technically, I'm sure there are those who understand congressional procedure better than I do who say, yes, the U.S. could get its thing done, sometime next year, and then that gives us, less than a year to really unleash our diplomats on the globe to try to get the next 40 countries to do their process. But it's, the sooner the better, the longer the late, the longer the worse. So I don't think there's any way to kind of call it done one way or the other. I will mention that one of the interesting things that came out of the conversation at the last summit was the overlapping nature of the whole range of nuclear treaties. And I will highlight Indonesia's interest in developing what they call a treaty ratification kit that essentially builds on some of the legal work that the IAEA has done in providing model legislation for nuclear security treaty implementation, and try to pull those together into allowing countries that if they pass, just kind of one big chunk of legislation, it gets them set up legislatively and in terms of their own criminal codes and so on, to be able to ratify very quickly a whole range of nuclear treaties. And so it's an interesting idea. It's one they're working with the
There's
UN.
a phone app for that, I think. Soon.
There's an app for that. That would be great. A ratification app. So they're working with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime as well as the IAEA to develop that concept, and we are eager to see them succeed as something that a piece of the puzzle. We can lean on countries, and then here comes the kit that makes it easy for them to do the thing we're leaning on them to do. As far as our priorities for the 2014 summit, I mentioned most of them earlier. I think we'll see what the Dutch are laying out for their priorities when we get together in Istanbul. I think that's the primary thing. We're not going to start negotiating text. We're not going to roll up our sleeves. And I think I would echo again. I think what has been a fairly constant U.S. policy and approach to these summits is communiques are great, but what really matters is what countries are doing. Those get manifested in house gifts. We had the new concept of gift baskets at the last summit, where countries joined together to identify specific things they were going to do, not simply things that they were going to support or encourage or, in a consensus way, associate themselves with. So I'll be interested to see whether the gift basket concept broadens or deepens, or how that develops over the next 18 months. A lot of countries made a lot of promises in their gift baskets, and obviously what matters is words more so than deeds or deeds more so than words on this topic. So that's really the goal. Is the world different meaningfully on nuclear security after the next summit? And I think there's lots of ways the answer to that can be yes.
Great. If there are no more questions, are there any online? Okay. You just really want them to get back to work and do the real hard work of securing the U.S. from nuclear terrorism.
Well, if I could just quickly add,
Please,
in
Chris,
connection
yeah.
with Laura's last remarks, that's a subject perhaps for the commentariat out there, and all of you, us, and so forth. That these promises made at these summits, can't and shouldn't just be taken at face value. And I think there's a responsibility on all of us, both in government and out of government, to keep an eye on these things and to, in a sense, hold people accountable for doing what they claim that they've done. It sounds wonderful to say, look, I'm going to solve this problem, forgive me, within 4 years or by next week for the summit or whatever else. But it's important to go back and look and say, well, what did they actually do? And how are they doing on? Are they serious? What does this mean? What's happening? Are they making progress towards handling the challenges that, and it's a dynamic world too, right? We're not just talking about securing within 4 years all the materials that existed in April of 2009. These are things that are being created all the time. We've yet to get a handle on the creation of new fissile materials around the world. That's an additional challenge we perhaps need to be thinking about. So this is an ongoing process for all countries involved, and I think we all have a role to play in helping keep the pronouncers honest in the course of the diplomacy involved here.
Great. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
And I also want to thank Connect US Fund again for making this possible. I'm very pleased to thank the Hudson team who helped us today. Grace Terzian's no longer here, but Perry, James, and Marco are in the back, so please give them a warm hand for what I think will be an enduring value once it's on the internet for everybody. Thank you. Bye.